Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, a special in-depth look at the war on drugs. First, the drug dependents, not those who use but rely on the illegal cocaine trade. We're in Peru to see the farmers and the poverty that keeps them in the drugs trade. And we're in Mexico following the money. You know all about the drugs cartels, but how are their billions integrated back into the Mexican economy? So another special edition of Counting the Cost this week, leaving aside the weekly economic developments and instead focusing on one issue. This time, it is the war on drugs. Because think about the cost to be counted in lives and deaths, the human cost of drugs, the dealers who make their millions, sometimes billions from the drugs trade, the suppliers, the growers, some who are simply doing it as a means to an end, the end being, well, making money and simply supporting themselves. We've got a stack of great reports and guests for you this week to put the whole drug story into some context, but we do want to start with some numbers really, because they will give you an idea of how big and costly this business is. And we should say that providing accurate estimates isn't always easy, given this is an unregulated, illegal market we're talking about, but the numbers we do have are quite telling. For example, this one, $332 billion. That is, at a retail level, what the global illegal drugs trade is worth. And that's hardly surprising because of the extraordinary demand. Up to 272 million people used illicit substances in the year of 2010. To counter it, the international community is spending about $100 billion a year fighting the war on drugs, and that is possibly a conservative estimate. But you have to wonder, is it all just throwing good money after bad, given that less than, well, 1% of illicit financial flows are actually seized, and much of that is actually attributed to the drugs trade. And of course, we can't forget the human cost. Up to 263,000 deaths are put down to illicit drug use. Now, those are the broad numbers. What we want to do is also give you an idea of how it sort of works in reality, and we're going to use the cocaine market of the Americas, which is one of the biggest illegal drugs markets in the world, as a brief case study. Now, at a production level, pretty much 100% of coca leaf, the raw ingredient for cocaine, is produced in the Andean region, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia. And from that, and this is according to the United Nations, the region produced more than 1,000 metric tons of cocaine. This was for the year 2009. But in recent years, the crackdown on Colombian drugs groups has meant smuggling and wholesale has largely moved to Mexico, where it accounts for the equivalent of 2.5% of that country's GDP. It's not all a loss for those fighting the trade. A significant amount is still seized. We're talking about 700 metric tons of purity-adjusted cocaine in the Americas in 2009, but there's still plenty more available for consumption, more than 400 metric tons, in fact, of cocaine. Again, that is 2009. So with demand and consumption as high as they are, we have to question if this war on drugs has actually been worth it, or at the least, has it been working? Leaders in Latin America are now demanding fresh debate, actually. They're calling for discussions on things like decriminalization and regulation. One of them is the president of Guatemala, Otto Perez Molina, who spoke to our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman.
I'd like to start by telling you this. You know, you have taken your country, the United States, and indeed the world by surprise by being the first sitting president to actually dare to have the audacity to propose that illegal drugs be legalized as a way of combating drug trafficking. Why do you think that that is such a good idea?
First of all, 20 years ago, when I was co-director of intelligence, I fought against drug trafficking, along with anti-narcotic services from El Salvador, Honduras, and the United States. We had some success. There were large confiscations. The biggest drug tracker was arrested in Guatemala.
Chapo Guzman, you were the one who arrested him, no?
Exactly. He was handed over to Mexican authorities. But now, 20 years later, I find he is again at large and appears in a magazine as one of the world's richest men. In addition, I find that crime, corruption and violence have grown in my country, while the cartels have spilled over from Mexico into Guatemala. Our institutions have been weakened, and this is happening elsewhere. So now I ask myself, are we doing things right? Do we have the right strategy? Or do we have to reflect and sit down to think about new alternatives and methods to fight drug trafficking? That's what has inspired our proposal.
Well, some experts argue that the problem with the current policy is that moral principles are being applied to what is an economic problem. So my question is, exactly how would your proposal work?
We have spent billions of dollars over the last 40 years in a drug war that has solved nothing. So, beyond legalizing or regulating drugs, what I am putting on the table here today at the Summit of the Americas is a call for a debate, a dialogue, where we have statistics, studies, serious analysis of the subject, and based on this come up with alternatives, rather than keep doing the same things we've been doing that has clearly shown that we are not winning the war against drugs.
The economic power of drug trafficking is what presumably you are trying to cripple by legalizing drugs. But what does this mean then, that young people can just go and buy cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines on demand? I mean, what would happen? Wouldn't that create more drug addicts, as some people say?
Our proposal is based on the view that if drug distribution is regulated, it will end the black market. Today, the cartels are powerful precisely because of the black market. 1 kilo of cocaine that here in Colombia costs $1,000 or $1,200, by the time it gets to Guatemala, it costs $10,000 to $10,500. And when it gets to the southern US border, it costs between $60,000 and $80,000. In the northern part of the United States, that same kilo that began at $1,000 here can fetch as much as $160,000. And along that road, as the price rises, it leaves corruption and death in its path. When we talk about regulating drugs, we would expect, first of all, that the cartels that thrive on the black market would disappear. We would expect that prices would go down and be regulated, but of course that does not mean that you can buy drugs on every corner. No, they would be regulated. It's a process in which nations would have to reach an agreement to mark a new path to manage this. But the important thing is that we dare to put this topic on the table. Not the ex-presidents, but the presidents who are in office. We must all discuss options to do away with the myth that these things cannot be talked about.
Well, you have certainly dropped a bomb by proposing this. President Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia has said that many of your peers actually agree with what you are proposing, but that they are afraid to come out publicly as you have for fear of being stigmatized or crucified, in fact, I think he said. So without asking you to be too indiscreet, just how many other heads of state have come out and supported you in what you're doing?
It doesn't matter if you agree or disagree with depenalization of the regulation of narcotics. The point is for the heads of state to be open to a dialogue, to discuss the subject responsibly, with arguments, statistics, analysis from experts who can guide us, so we can make educated decisions. I think everyone can agree on that.
What has been the feedback that you have had?
We've had responses from even outside of our region, and that's important. It's a proposal we've been discussing in Central America, and it's spread to all the Americas, and further, because drugs is a global problem. We've received negative, but also very positive responses. I just had a meeting with a person who represents the views of all people in the political parties in the UK, and he told me I had the support of 80 MPs who want us to continue in this struggle that we are embarked upon.
I understand that you have also suggested that countries like the United States pay for at least half of the cost of confiscating an interdiction.
That's right, it's one of our proposals, so that we don't limit ourselves to the topic of legalizing drugs. It is another option to strengthen interdiction, and for that we need compensation for the confiscations we make. Compensation for the destruction of the drug crops. We could use the money to improve the equipment of our security forces, to allow for more effective interdiction, for education and for other needs.
What has been the reaction from the U.S. government?
From the very first day, in less than 24 hours after I had made the proposal, the U.S. Embassy was sending out a communique expressing its staunch opposition. Then the U.S. Vice President came to Central America to say the same thing. And more recently, the Undersecretary for Security, Bromsfeld, who deals with the drug issue, came. I found for the first time that while he did not agree with legalization, he did acknowledge that we could sit down and discuss it to hear each other's arguments. And I think that signals a very big difference. That's an important first step taken by the United States.
Well, as you know, there is widespread speculation that the real motivation behind your idea to shake up the drug debate is to get the United States to end the embargo on arms sales to Guatemala, and also to increase or rather begin large arms sales and aid to your country, military aid. What do you say to that?
No es cierto. No, it's not true. The embargo goes back 30 years. At the time, we were living an internal conflict, a guerrilla war that lasted 36 years. But today, the embargo is more symbolic than anything else. Of course, we would like them to lift the embargo because it's kind of a stigma. But I must tell you that it is not the motivation for this proposal. The only motivation is to find a new path because what we have been doing is a failure.
Mr. President, you were just talking about wanting to have peace in Guatemala. Your country, indeed almost every country in Central America, has lived throughout decades of first civil war and now this horrible violence provoked by organized crime and drug trafficking. How much longer do you think this is going to go on?
This has been a truly lamentable situation because we have been fighting wars that as Guatemalans we don't belong in. The internal conflict in Guatemala that lasted 36 years was brought on by the Cold War, and we had to pay for it with blood. And now, after we signed the peace accords, we continue to pay with blood for a war that is not ours. A war that because of a geographical fluke, we find ourselves caught in the middle of. In the middle of where drugs are produced and where the main drug consumers live. And as I say, we Central Americans are paying with blood for a war that we should have nothing to do with. And that's why we are making this appeal for a dialogue to find other ways out of this, to allow us to end this war successfully.
So that was the perspective there of someone operating at the top end of the debate, the decision makers, those who actually have some influence. What about those at the very bottom, though? The people who are, in the end, supplying the drugs, or at least the raw materials, but are only doing so because their very existence depends on it. Lucia Newman went to meet the coca farmers of the Vrey region in Peru.
It's the rainy season in Peru's tropical Vrey Valley. So when the sun comes out, so too does the livelihood of coca farmers, like Florencio Pacheco. The leaves must be dried, like this, he says, before he can go sell it to those who turn it into coca paste and then cocaine.
We could grow something else. We've been trying to get support since last year to grow eucalyptus, another fine wood, here in the valley, but so far nothing.
In less than 10 years, the Vrey Valley has turned into the world's most dense coca-producing region. Isolated, with impassable roads, and almost no presence of the state. In the meantime,
the narcos are investing a huge amount of money in order to have a good environment for their business. So they are corrupting not only the judiciary system, they are corrupting the armed forces, they are corrupting the police, they are corrupting the political parties.
Vamos subiendo para arriba.
Like most farmers, Leoncio Sosa migrated here to the Vrey Valley from the Peruvian highlands, drawn by the dream of making easy money from coca. But as he takes us to see his coca seedlings ready for transplanting, he complains that drug traffickers are getting rich, while he can barely make a living.
This is my avocado. I could also produce peanuts and coffee, top-of-the-line products, but we need the presence of the state, technical assistance, and access to loans, too.
Peru has not only now surpassed Colombia as the #1 producer of this plant, but it has also become the world's first or largest exporter of cocaine. And that's not because Peru produces more than Colombia, but because so much less of it is actually confiscated in this country.
Peru's government has just announced a $1 billion plan to combat drug trafficking and reduce illegal coca crops by 1/3, or nearly 50,000 hectares by the year 2016. People like Leoncio Sosa want to know how much of that money might go to creating conditions that would allow them to no longer depend on drug trafficking to survive. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, in the Vrey Valley, Peru.
So as you saw there, the likes of Peru's Vrey region farmers are at the bottom of the food chain in this story. They make enough to survive. Others, though, are cashing in to the tune of millions, sometimes billions of dollars. For example, in 2008, the US cocaine market was valued at $35 billion. The Andean coca farmers, remember them, they made up to $1 billion, which is actually only 1% of all international cocaine profits. The traffickers in these source countries, they pulled in, well, around $400 million And the ones making the most, though, they're the international traffickers, groups like the infamous Mexican cartels, who bring in up to $40 billion each year, which incidentally is about the same amount the US government is spending on actually fighting the war on drugs. And then beyond all that, when you look at the human cost, which we always have to consider, you start to wonder what the money spent fighting the war is actually achieving. Central and South America, well, they've got the second and third highest homicide rates in the world, respectively. Colombia itself, the highest number of internally displaced people in the world, up to 5 million of them. And the United States has an estimated 6.2 million cocaine users. In 2010, 1.6 million people in the United States were arrested on some sort of drugs charge. So again, and we keep asking this question over and over again, is this war working? Let's ask Dr. Kevin Sabet. He's an assistant professor at the University of Florida College of Medicine, a former advisor as well to multiple White House administrations on national drugs policy. Dr. Sabet joins us from Boston. The Mexican drugs cartels, as I said there, they rake in about $40 billion a year. The US spends the same on the war on drugs. If this was a business transaction, you'd say government's not getting value for money.
Well, I would argue that they are, although I think the numbers are probably closer to 20 billion when you look at federal numbers. Of course, state and local are mainly covering the expenses for treatment and prevention. But when you look at actually the costs of doing nothing, we would see that we would be much more in the hole there. If you look at our legal drugs, for example, right now, alcohol and tobacco alone cost the United States over $400 billion in lost social costs. That's from loss of productivity to healthcare costs to premature death and illness. We get about $40 billion in revenues from those two legal drugs. So that's about a 10-to-1 ratio. And we know that legality and legalization would simply increase use and availability. So that doesn't mean we can't make improvements of current policy. Of course we should. Anybody looking at this issue would agree with that. But to offer such an extreme response, as many have, to legalize drugs, we'd be much more in the red than we'd want to be.
Well, let me quote you something here, and for our viewers as well. This is from the Office
Sure.
of National Drug Control Policy Reauthorization Act of 1998, which basically says no federal funds shall be spent on studying or in fact anything related to the legalization of these substances. I mean, to talk about it, to study it, to put some money into the idea, you couldn't call that an extreme idea. That's just looking at all sides of the story and considering all possible options.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of looking at those sides. And in fact, more and more people have called for a debate on this internationally. I think a lot of people are ready to have that debate. Now, that debate is very different than just presenting one side of it, which I think a lot of this has been, and saying that legalization is the only answer to our current problems. We know that if we invest more in reducing the demand in the United States, so that's prevention, treatment, but it's also intervention, it's working with the criminal justice system with things like drug courts, which have proven to be effective, things like testing and sanctions programs and probation. There's a whole host of things that can be done to do a much better job of reducing demand in the U.S. On the other side of it, though, internationally, it also tells us that we need to invest more in alternative livelihood, more in combating institutional corruption and financial crimes. I mean, the idea that legalization would wipe out the institutional problems that, for example, is going on in Mexico, as the example you brought up, is ludicrous. There are fundamental problems related to poverty, related to healthcare, related to education, related to corruption, related to policing. We could go on and on. Those things need to be dealt with one by one in a comprehensive way, sort of like we did in Colombia. If I can just say, Plan Colombia, which was President Clinton's major achievement in Latin America, was also ran also by President Bush, a bipartisan effort. This was a country, 15 years ago that you could not go to. There were no tourists. There were people being killed left and right. There was institutional corruption, up and down the political spectrum. And when we actually worked with partners in the region and invested in not only things like Apache helicopters, but you need those too, but also invested in the people of that country, invested in alternative livelihoods, gave people a chance. We've seen a major turnaround, and it's really a huge success story that's barely talked about. Imagine if we did that in these other countries, if we learned and applied the lessons that we learned in Colombia, which has now made Medellin, which is shocking to even think about, is a top 10 travel destination by National Geographic. I mean, it's a wonderful turnaround story. Why don't we do that and try and apply those lessons in those other countries? And I think until we actually make that effort, to say that we need something as extreme as legalization is pretty irresponsible.
Yeah, okay, but what about the flip side to what happened in Colombia? You've given us all the positive examples there. What about the idea that it actually just spread the problem further afield in South America and Latin America, and that you've still got the same number of users just elsewhere?
Yeah, well, that's my point. I mean, so the point is, when you only work in one country then, in one area, and you don't implement those same policies in the region, you are going to have that displacement effect, or as some have said, push down, pop up. And that's a real concern, but I wouldn't say that's a fault of the policy. That's a fault of not implementing that policy throughout the region. And so, today, and you're right, I mean, today we have, for example, cocaine is far less in terms of the cost has increased, the purity has decreased, which means that the cocaine producers, especially in Colombia, are really on the run. But you're right, they're just being displaced. They're now moving through West Africa, presenting that region with a whole host of problems now with drugs, and moving drugs to Europe through the African corridor. That's a major problem as well. So this is obviously a global issue. We need to tackle it everywhere. We can't focus on one place and hope it's gonna go away. And this idea that legalization then is gonna make these drug cartels pack up and go home is totally ludicrous when you look at the actual situation of the cartels. These people are dealing with human trafficking. They're the biggest purveyors of piracy issues and illegal goods. They're dealing with many other drugs other than marijuana. In fact, a recent RAND study said that marijuana is just a small minority of the revenue that Mexican drug cartels, Mexican drug organizations get. So this idea that if you legalize one or even a few drugs and that's going to solve the cartel problem isn't really, doesn't measure up with reality. Unless you started to legalize human trafficking, piracy, methamphetamine, cocaine, then we could see what would happen with the underground market. But I don't think we're prepared to do that.
I notice you keep using the word legalization, which, as you said, is maybe a bit extreme. But what about taking a step back from that? The thing that, in fact, a lot of leaders in Latin America are saying, and that is decriminalization or regulation, treating drugs the same way that we treat, not exactly the same way, but using the model, if you like, of alcohol and tobacco.
Right.
What about that sort of idea, rather than the legalization, as you say?
Well, that idea is legalization. So that latter idea you talked about of alcohol and tobacco, those are legal drugs. Regulation is another word for legalization. So that's one side. And as I said, our experience with alcohol and tobacco shows that there's a 10-to-1 ratio in terms of costs to revenues. So it's not a tax gainer. And in fact, we know that when you put excessive taxes on these goods, for example, tobacco, you see an underground market. And the underground market of cigarettes is thriving, especially in the United States, in the eastern United States. When Canada put a $3 tax levy about a decade ago on cigarettes, they had an underground market come up the next day. So this idea that these endemic black markets for illegal drugs that have been there for decades are going to go away under what you call this regulation or legalization doesn't add up to the experience. Now, you talk about decriminalization, and I think that word is often thrown around interchangeably with legalization. Those are obviously two different things, but remember, Mexico already has decriminalization. So Mexico has, in fact, taken away the idea of a criminal sanction against somebody with small amounts. So that's already happening, and I don't think that that's curtailed the cartels at all. In the United States, marijuana is effectively decriminalized. In most states and localities where people might be arrested and given a short record for an arrest, it's really no more than a parking ticket in most cases where it's marijuana only. And so, the idea that, let's decriminalize, we're actually experimenting with that in many parts of the region. It doesn't touch cartels. In fact, if anything, research has shown that decriminalization could almost have even a perverse effect, because if it leads to increased use, but it doesn't cover and doesn't touch the black market, because under decriminalization, the production and trafficking is still illegal. But if it increases use, then you actually have more users, more of a demand, which just fuels the cartels even more. So you're right, we need to make these policy distinctions, but we need to be careful to throw labels around that mean, 10 different things to 10 different people.
Dr. Kevin Sabet, they're giving us some US perspective on how the war on drugs is being fought. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We've mentioned Mexico a lot in this program, quite simply because it's at the heart of the debate. 95% of cocaine that arrives in the United States, for example, transits through the Mexico-Central America corridor. That means billions of dollars in profits, of course, for the drugs cartels. But it also means the economy is getting a kind of backhanded boost. We'll let Adam Rainey explain in this report from Mexico City.
Money. Lots of it. By some estimates, $40 billion are generated by Mexico's drug trade. The bloody drug war has left more than 50,000 people dead, but also left behind a trail of profits as drug smuggling to the United States continues and the internal drug market in Mexico grows bigger year by year. But what do Mexico's major drug traffickers buy with all that cash? As auctions show, gold-plated guns, jets, and cars are just a few of the items. Mexico's so-called narco museum has even more drug runner fashion on display. Clearly, narco gang fashion is all about the bling. Still, with billions of dollars at their disposal, luxury items aren't the only thing. They're buying up stocks, real estate, even hotels and tourist resorts like Cancun. Some of the dirty cash is smuggled across the U.S. border in the back of trucks. Some of it crosses the border electronically in massive bank wire transfers. And with all their cash, drug cartels have come up with all kinds of ways to clean their money once it's in the country. In some parts of the country, beauty salons and spas are used as fronts. In others, construction firms pad their buildings with higher estimates and the money is cleaned up that way. Throughout the country, Mexicans consider empty restaurants a sign that the establishment could be a front to launder millions of dollars. Although it's far from the front lines of the drug war, Mexico City is considered to be a place where lots of drug money laundering is taking place. In fact, the U.S. government has a list of 500 businesses and individuals in Mexico that it suspects of laundering money for drug gangs. And on that list is this restaurant right here. The U.S. government suspects it of laundering money for perhaps one of the most powerful and largest drug gangs in Mexico. We asked the manager if the report has hurt the restaurant's business. He refused to let us film on the premises, but off camera, he called it a ridiculous report and said lawyers are dealing with the allegations.
Of US dollars.
We asked the head of the UN Office for Drugs and Organized Crime in Mexico how so many suspected money launderers could operate in the open.
Developing investigation that allow to really prosecute a big money launderer are extremely complex. And are extremely complex not only because of the technicalities, also because when you investigate financially important people, you know from the very beginning that you will encounter a number of obstacles in your investigation. It's much easier to investigate and jail a small drug trafficker rather than a big tycoon that among his many financial activity also offered his financial structure for laundering money.
So if we know who these people are, why aren't authorities going after them?
Because through their money, they buy impunity and they create the network that allow them to operate with impunity.
Mexican politicians and authorities say they have weak laws to chase down money launderers, but a new law to make money laundering tougher is making its way through the Congress.
Exactamente.
Former prosecutor Samuel Gonzalez says it's going to take time for Mexico to really tackle the problem of money laundering, especially with so many businesses not wanting to really change the status quo.
Nuestros empresarios y las personas que están en México normalmente
Mexican businessmen normally don't set up preventative measures against money laundering because they know the justice system is weak, and as a result it can be circumvented with good lawyers or corruption. Therefore, Mexican businessmen aren't proactive in preventing laundering or other crimes because they know they can deal with it in other ways.
A culture of inertia and impunity unlikely to change anytime soon, and until it does, Mexico will be awash in drug money.
I want to get even more of an idea now of what impact that money is having on the ground. Joining us from Mexico City is Armando Santa Cruz. He is the founder of the NGO Mexico United Against Crime. Armando, we saw in that report how the cartel drugs money goes back into the economy. Money laundering is all it is, really. Talk us through the sort of effect that has on legitimate business in Mexico.
Well, there are several terrible impacts on the legitimate business in Mexico. First of all, because in some areas where laundering money is relatively easy, a lot of drug money has entered the economy, and the competition is totally unfair. It's not a level playing field for the legitimate business people. So what we're having is some areas of the country where certain business endeavors are suffering in the legitimate traditional business, while the drug money and their associates, the associates of the drug cartels, are doing a brisk business in the process of cleaning and laundering that money. What we see a pretty clear influence of them, for example, in tourism, because hotels are a good way to launder money, and real estate. So that's a big problem. A little bit we see also in agriculture and in cattle breeding. So it certainly is a very contaminating influence for the economy.
So in that case, how do you pull it back? How do you get the power? And I'm focusing on business here rather than the actual drugs problem itself. But how do you get the power into the hands of legitimate business? Or in fact, is the power that the drugs cartels now have just too great?
Well, we think there has to be two approaches to reduce this. The first and most important is to take the huge profits out of the drug trade. And that's why our organization, México Unido contra la Delincuencia, has been pushing for a change in the regulation and a change in the approach to the current drug war. We believe that if markets were regulated by the state and drugs were sold under regulated markets, the profits would be undercut. And all this dirty money that enters the system, which is currently several tens of billions of dollars, would disappear. That's one big important issue that we think should be attacked. And the second very important one is to tighten the laundering laws. And amongst other things, a very important one is to make the use of cash very difficult. Currently in Mexico, many transactions can still be concluded in cash, and we believe a way of making life difficult for dirty money, not only from drug dealing, is to force all the players to go through the banking system. In other words, to use checks, credit cards, so they are registered and the money cannot move within the economy with such ease.
Okay, let's talk some more about the idea of regulation of the industry, as you seem to be putting it, changing the whole tack of the war on drugs and realigning the way it's being fought. Again, do you think that can actually work, that regulation of such a powerful and such a damaging industry like illegal drugs could actually be achieved?
Well, we actually do think it will work. It's not panacea or paradise. It will have its downsides, but we've seen it with many drugs that are currently legal in the Western world, such as alcohol or nicotine, tobacco. Tobacco is much more addictive, for example, than marijuana, and alcohol is also more addictive and has much more collateral damage, and nonetheless they are legal drugs, and they are approached with a public health approach rather than with a police or military approach. Currently in Mexico at least, and I would say in the US and most of Latin America, the drug problem is approached from a criminal perspective, from a police perspective, using the army, and it's all punitive approach, and there's no real approach from a public health point of view, which we think the problem is really a public health problem. And the problem with approaching it with a police approach is that the more you enforce tough laws and the more you enforce a police approach, the higher the premiums for the drug dealers and the higher the money they make. So the more money they make, the more they corrupt the institutions, the more they are able to enter the legitimate economy and achieve power, the more they can influence elections through dirty money in the elections. So really think the price Mexico is paying is huge, not only Mexico, Guatemala, and some other Central American countries. If you see the number of deaths in Mexico, it's close to the number of deaths since President Calderon started. It's close to the number of deaths that the U.S. incurred in its whole Vietnam War adventure. And so you're talking about tens of thousands of people, and that's on top of the number of countries, of companies that have had to close their doors because of drug extortion, because of the violence in the cities. Some parts of Mexico, such as Coahuila, Ciudad Juárez, Tamaulipas, are places where most of the entrepreneurial class has left the place, most of the professional class has left the place, doctors, accountants, lawyers, anyone who can afford to leave the place leaves it. Specialized blue-collar workers, skilled workers are moving to other places, and the damage for those regions is huge. It's incalculable. It really hasn't been calculated up to now, but it seems that a lot of people in Latin America are realizing that the cost is not really worthwhile. We are really paying a cost that our countries cannot sustain for in the long run. So that's why we are pushing for a change in the approach to the drug strategy.
That is Armando Santa Cruz from Mexico United Against Crime. Thank you so much for your time, sir. All right, one more guest to talk to this week, someone representing those who want to see some big changes in the way the war on drugs is fought. He's Danny Kushlik, Director of the Transform Drug Policy Foundation, joining us from Bristol in the UK. And you and I, Danny, are sitting here talking about this issue, regulation. But it seems the people who matter, the decision makers in political circles, aren't. What is your take on why they won't discuss this?
Well, the reason they can't talk about it is because the war on drugs has been a catastrophic global failure now for many years. And any scrutiny, any investigation of its success and efficacy is bound to end in the conclusion that it has been a total failure and needs to end forthwith, which is why we are now, for the first time, about to discuss alternatives, including legalization and regulation.
Okay, so in essence, it's almost sounding like pride is getting in the way, but surely there must be a realization that you need to learn from your mistakes, and that any mistakes, perceived or otherwise, have to be addressed.
Pride isn't the issue. That's not the way that international geopolitics works. What we have here are enormous political and financial vested interests. There are empires that have been built upon this. An enormous amount of political capital has been built upon the idea of being tough on drugs and winning. And the last thing that politicians want to do is turn around and admit failure and explore alternatives. And any exploration of alternatives is bound to show that the only way forward here is to end the war on drugs in the same way that we ended the alcohol prohibition in the 30s and replace it with a system of legalized regulation. But let's not forget that the vested interests here are predominantly those of the United States of America. And that's a huge political force to be grappling with. And to the extent that the US wants to hang on to this, it's very difficult to supersede.
Okay, just go back to a point you made before about the alcohol model or the tobacco model even. Do you think those could work? They're taxed to the hilt. Could that actually work for drugs? Or is there a workable model to be made from those ones, do you think, for drugs?
Well, we know that within the regulated drug systems, and that's licensed retail, alcohol and tobacco, pharmacy dispensing models, and through prescription by doctors, that those systems of regulation are not controlled by international organized crime, insurgents, paramilitaries and separatists, that those are run by doctors, by pharmacists, and by commercial interests that are overseen by government control and regulation. We know that those systems are robust enough to control price, outlets, make sure that young people don't have access through the legal methods to get hold of these things, and that is a vastly, despite its faults, and there are some, that is a vastly better method of controlling the trade in drugs and vulnerable people's access to them than gifting it to organized criminals and unregulated dealers. It's a no-brainer.
Danny, in your capacity with the Transform Drug Policy Foundation, do you go and talk directly to the politicians, to the real decision makers high up in UK politics, for example? And if so, what do they tell you when you put all of this to them?
Well, the first thing is that the war on drugs has been a failure all over the world, including the UK, where our prison population is twice as high as it should be, where an enormous amount of property crime is committed to support heroin and crack dependency, and where here the trade is worth $6 billion and costs $20 billion a year. But no politician in the UK will talk about it. However, we are now for the first time talking to politicians in Latin America because the level of crisis there is extraordinary. So that what's happened in the States where there are insurgents who are corrupting governments and at this point subverting the legitimacy of the state itself, those are the people that we can do business with. So for the first time, because those politicians are willing to engage with this issue not only with us, but actually with the US at the upcoming summit of the Americas, actually challenging the US in its orthodoxy of the war on drugs. Those are the people that we can talk to. But here, where the government is willing to put up with the collateral damage of prohibition, of the war on drugs, we can't. And it seems now that it is the crisis that it is enabling us to enter into that dialogue. And currently UK politicians don't see that crisis at a level that warrants exploring alternatives. They're happy to continue running a regime that is screwing up the very communities that they claim to protect.
All right, Danny Kushler, great to get your thoughts on this issue. Thank you for your time. And that is where we're going to leave you for this week. Another special in-depth edition of Counting the Cost. This time our special mention has to go to producer Samuel Hunt, who worked extremely hard to bring together all the elements for this show. As ever, if you want to get in touch with him or with us, here are the details. You can send a tweet to me at Kamal AJE, our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, or if you're not on Twitter, emails just fine. countingthecost at aljazeera.net is the address. While you're online, you can head to aljazeera.com/business, link on to the CTC page. We put all our episodes up in full there for you to catch up on. And in fact, this week there will be extended content posted online from this particular show. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.